There you go. You guys can all hear me? Okay, great. I guess I'll start. So my name is Camilla. I'm the SIG lead for SIGPolicy, and this is Pranav. He's also a SIG lead. We got someone else who's coming, but he went to grab cups for you guys, and his name is Daniel. I will let him introduce himself once he gets here.
And hi, I'm Minh. I'm SIG lead for SIGPwny. So I see a lot of familiar faces, a lot of SIGPwny people here. So hello. And today we're going to be presenting on cyberwarfare. Mainly, we're going to be focusing a lot on the policy side of things, which is why we're making this SIGPwny x SIGPolicy collab meeting. Yeah, I'll get started. Okay, so just as a sort of overview of what we're going to go through today, we sort of broke up this presentation into 3 parts. So the first is what is cyberwarfare, which I'll present, and then Camille will present global cyberwarfare policy, and also current American policy on cyberwarfare.
That's him. That's Daniel.
That's Daniel. So first up, what is cyberwarfare? So when we think of cyber warfare, right, we kind of focus a lot on the war part, right? If you like, can someone like, you know, when you think of the word cyber warfare, what's the first thing that pops in your head? Yeah.
Hacking a country.
Hacking a country. Okay. Yeah. About other ideas?
Stuxnet.
Stuxnet. Yeah. That's on the slide. Yeah.
Well, I can say that.
Okay. Awesome. Yeah. For me, I actually think of like military drones, sort of, right? Although that is a more you know, physical military application. But cyber warfare can invoke a lot of thoughts because we've seen, like, you know, movies and things like that. But for the purposes of our presentation, we're going to be focusing more on like the use of anything like technological on computer networks. So we're not going to be focusing on, like, you know, weapons that kind of kill people directly, right? But rather weapons that aim to cripple computer systems. So for example, a big popular example is espionage, right? A lot of computer systems are carrying a lot of important information and intelligence. So everybody wants to hack each other to try to steal information. Sabotaging equipment. So Stuxnet was a very popular example of this. Where basically, allegedly, the U.S. government wrote a virus that infected different ICS systems and related to power plants. And this was released and affected a lot of systems in Iran. And then another part of thinking about this is also targeting civilians, right? Because a lot of our lives run on the electrical grid, so taking out that would effectively trouble a country pretty fast and cause a lot of panic. So when should cyber warfare go hot? So what I mean by this is, are there any systems that demand war if destroyed, right? Like if you target a hospital, that is clearly you know, like almost a war crime. Right? It is a war crime, right? You're taking down, you're targeting a hospital where there's, you know, innocent civilians, and but there's also examples like, what about military systems, right? Do we consider that fine, right? If we're attacking a military base versus a hospital. So yeah, and then I already brought up the concept of electrical grids, but there's also a lot of other critical network and infrastructure in our society, like sort of related to the hospital side, medical infrastructure. So things related to like even personal devices in our bodies, right? Like insulin pumps or pacemakers. So this also kind of goes into IoT networks as well, and need to secure those.
Okay, so after Minh explained a little bit about what exactly cyber warfare is and, you know, what it entails, let's get into how exactly are global politics impacting the US first before he gets into how the US is impacting everybody else. And global politics, it's not just about the policies itself, but rather what they're actually doing. So when it comes to cyber warfare, some of the characteristics of having a cyber warfare are less than armed conflict. So there are definitely going to be less like direct civilian deaths, like Minh said. So that means they're targeting a lot more, like you said, hacking. And then there's also a lot more just trying to stop the running of the system of another country rather than, directly trying to kill somebody else. Second one, more democratic. When I say more democratic, I don't actually mean it's more democratic, but rather cyber warfare is a lot more accessible to everybody else. It's like if you, like quite literally to dumb it down, if you got a hacker, you can try to hack someone else's country's network. So it means that you don't have to invest like billions of dollars into coming up with a military system that has all of these things that you would need in like a regular combat war. The third one, joint use targets. So essentially what this means is that a lot of times when you think of war or just any conflict, you think of military targeting each other. And like in terms of cyber warfare, you would think that, hackers from a country would attack the system of another military, but rather they can attack anything. So for example, you can attack oil pipeline communications, and that could go down. You can attack electrical systems. For example, one of the more joint use target, it's not necessarily attack, but if it were to be attacked, it could potentially be something like when Microsoft had a blue screen during, when was that? The airplane? Oh, last summer. So if some country were to attack our airport system, that would be something that could happen. And then it's affecting more like civilians rather than, just military. And then the last of it is it's not necessarily bound by the rules of war because as I'll get into in the next slide, when you send out a troop into another country or when you declare a battle on someone else, you're declaring it on behalf of that country. But when you're attacking in cyber warfare, it's a lot more of how can I get evidence that they're actually attacking us that's represented by that country. Okay, so some examples of global cyber warfare usages we can see from Russia, China, and North Korea. For example, with Russia, they are essentially using cyber operations in Ukraine in the Russian-Ukraine war. And then you can see that there has been an increase ever since 2021, where in December of 2021, there's not a lot, and then now in March of 2022, it rose to 120. And you can see the major rise is the actions on network. So when they attack like network systems, like hacking out different things, for example, hacking into government systems or just hacking into regular civilian systems that could damage like water supply, any daily supplies that you could or might need. And then the one for China, it's essentially US victims of Chinese cyber attacks over the past 5 years. So all of the red dots that you can see on the screens are essentially where they suspect that China are attacking, and there is US victims that are associated with governments or just regular operations. And then finally with North Korea, this is like their like hacking sort of situation. Like this is like what they're based under. And then finally, this is where I get into like how you can, it's kind of hard to draw a line on if that country is actually attacking you because it's a lot harder to find evidence. And this is where it comes in with non-state actors. Essentially what it is basically countries fund and organize a company that has plausible deniability. So like, you hire like a killer for you to kill someone, and and then they can basically share that technology and attack whoever they're targeting. And then the attack themselves are like these groups will carry out the attacks, such as colonial pipeline attacks, disrupting adversaries and collecting funds. And then they, with those non-state actors of these groups, they're not scared of being sued or like without being scared that there's going to be sanctions of war on them, because you're hiring somebody else. It's a lot harder to tell. And then finally, the targeting countries are largely unable to reprise, as it is very challenging to prove the length, as I was saying, because yes, like you could probably say that like this country is like country A hired someone to attack country B, but it's a lot harder to prove when it's not directly within the country. Like the government didn't say, let's attack that country. Like they didn't like, directly do it, which is very hard to, go back from country B to country A.
Right, and this also, I just want to briefly mention, this ties back to the concept of cyber warfare being more accessible, right? Because it's more accessible, it's kind of, it's like if you think about typical war, right? Like if some country were to order airstrikes against another country, it's kind of hard to refute claims that you did not do that, right? Because only like a nation state would have the capabilities and military funding to do that. But when we're in the digital landscape, anyone can do that, given that they have enough technical skills. So it's usually like not too difficult to attribute a certain attack to some nation state. However, you'll see there's a lot of different companies for like US-based companies that will label these threat actors and they have their own sort of system. So for example, I believe CrowdStrike has this two-word name system where they have basically a taxonomy to identify threat actors. And they can't really, they don't really identify threat actors by country, but rather by motive. Like for example, they'll have a word and then panda, and panda sort of represents the interests of China. But it's not necessarily China, because they can't really explicitly attribute it to just China, because a lot of the interests of countries are aligned, right? So, yeah.
And then one of the bigger questions that we want you guys to consider is how should nations respond to these attacks? Because like for us, for the US, responding is kind of hard. For example, as we saw in a previous graph with locations of the red dots of possible Chinese government attacking on the US. They can't really, like Minh said, can't really prove that it's them. While there is like it's probably them because it's in their favor or in their interest, but how can they counter it without, being pointed at and saying that you launched this attack on us and we didn't, that sort of situation. And the smaller question is, how confident do you need to be to, pinpoint or say that, hey, you launched a cyber attack on us?
Okay, so American policy can sort of be summarized as punch them in the face before they punch you. But to sort of elaborate on that, so US policy, there's two things that the US policy at least pretends. US policy says it's explicitly less than armed conflict. So, for example, US cyber departments have a much larger latitude to actually go and launch an attack in China or in Russia than a general could say, send this regiment over and start shooting. They obey the rules of war, which is what the US State Department says. We're going to go on the next slide into whether that's true or not, and I'll leave that up to you to decide. But offense is the best defense. There's no real way to defend, right? If you've ever built a building or built a piece of code, it's a lot easier to destroy things than just to make them actually secure. So what the US likes to do instead is go on the offense and hit back, which brings us to the fourth point. The US's main concern is non-state actors, right? the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, the main sort of attack vector, method of attack is funding these groups, as Camille mentioned. And so what the US does is we strike these non-state actors pretty much continuously. This has the advantage, right? Because the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans, they're saying these aren't part of their government, right? Which means that when the US goes in and hits them, they can't say, hey, you can't do that. That's our thing. Because of course, right? Then you've attacked the US. So there's huge US resources focused on hitting these groups first. Then for Russia specifically, right? We have these non-state actors, and we also have Russian cyber warfare, right? So this is, as we mentioned, for example, hacking drones out of the sky in the Ukrainian battlefield. This is hitting power grids. And so the US is trying to help Ukraine, especially for this specifically, it's a lot of private companies. So for example, the Ukrainian government pretty much runs off of Microsoft cloud services currently because it's just safer. And then allegedly, as about a decade ago, the US has control over the majority of the Russian power grid. There's a fight about this because the Russians don't really want to admit it. And the US is very happy not to admit it because that's decidedly a war crime. Yet evidence indicates. For China, the US, we strike these non-state actors and we put a lot of sanctions on them. And we try to prevent them from getting technological capabilities. We try to restrict new techniques from getting in. And then the US and China tends to rely less on private companies and much more on the NSA, which sort of has liability anyway, because the point is you don't know it is there. So as of a decade ago, which is the last time that we really have any sort of anything was leaked on US action, the indications are that Huawei was hacked, especially in their telecom services. So US actually has insertions in the hardware. And then that allowed them to attack a network called CERNET in China, which is one of the major sort of telecommunication networks. And then finally, we're spying on Chinese universities, especially the major technological ones. The Chinese are also spying on US technological universities, including probably here. So, keep that in mind, should be interesting. And then generally, we mentioned Stuxnet previously, right? That's sort of a US didn't do it type of affair, right? That allegedly it was the Israelis, but the US State Department random officials have said again and again, it was totally us. So think of that as you will. We strike North Korean groups pretty much continuously. You can't really put sanctions on a country that's already under complete and total sanctions. So the only real option there is to hit them. And then we're continuously trying to defend against these attacks. We're stopping, we stop a lot of the software attacks. Currently, as some of you may have heard, there are theoretically large hardware failings with our telecom networks, but that is a problem for another day. And then the sort of final question before we get into a little bit more specific questions is, how should we think of cyber warfare? Is this a threat on the level of nuclear weapons when they're first introduced? Can a sufficiently well-funded, sufficiently motivated individual today take out a power network and kill tens of thousands who rely on different forms of healthcare and on power and heating? Or is this simply a new frontier for a lower risk global warfare? Is this just countries annoying each other and testing each other to see what will happen, as opposed to a true existential crisis?
Before we continue, I just want to quickly also mention a little bit more about the US side of the policy things. So as you all know, like a lot of US hardware is manufactured in China. So China actually has incentive to, potentially mess with the manufacturing process of chips or CPUs for our computers and our laptops and mobile devices. So we actually have contractors that will do hardware verification. So this is sort of tapping in on the last point that Daniel made about hardware. But yeah, there's a lot of work and research into hardware verification.
And just a little on that, if you've heard of Trump's Project 2025, one of the things that he wanted to do was bring back those manufacturing factories back into the US, because he is concerned of some of the things that could happen if you have factories overseas where, the government isn't directly overlooking on them, where it's just contractors going in to check those things. So he kind of wants to, secure those.
Has anyone else heard of the CHIPS Act? Yeah, CHIPS Act. Yeah, that was signed by the Biden administration, but basically the concept was they wanted to bring chip manufacturing into the United States, again, for the reasons of national security. So that's also sort of interesting.
Although possibly also interesting is that one of the major beneficiaries of the CHIP Act is Intel, which is sort of the last American chip maker who are currently in sort of big trouble, and apparently as of like a day ago considering breaking up. So not great hardware wise, but okay. So now we've talked to you a lot. So now it's your turn. So we've got, how are we doing timing wise? Yeah, we've got 3 scenarios. So I'm gonna, what do you want to show or show this?
I didn't do the first one.
Oh. So yeah, we're gonna show you scenarios and we want to hear what you think. So scenario 1, we've abstracted, these are completely hypothetical scenarios, sort of, with hypothetical names because we're trying not to be too political here. So you are in our scenario 1, you're running the cybersecurity department of Narnia. Your adversary, the nation of Chard, launches a cyber attack that takes out an oil pipeline. Now, on the one hand, this is a military target. It supplies 30% of the fuel for your military, but it also provides the heating fuel for 70% of your nation. Now, you know that your military is stronger than the military of Chards, but your cybersecurity prowess is also greater. So in the cyber attack, which is a huge effect on your country, do you respond with a cyber attack of your own? Do you send in the army, or do you try to resort to diplomacy and say, hey, why'd you do this? And so first we want to hear some answers on this. Let's pretend for now no one died. It's just annoying. It hurts your economy. But what would any of you do? Any opinions, any thoughts? Yeah. Yeah, you certainly. Yep. That's very fair. There are some, we should probably make it not absolute. There are some scenarios where you have been able to say, like, hey, this is clearly a group affiliated with you. We know you did it. What on earth? But the problem is essentially there are only so many, diplomacy wise, like in the real world for a second, there are only so many sanctions you can actually put on a country, right? So when the Russians launch a cyber, like, for example, the colonial pipeline, as mentioned earlier, right? You can't put more sanctions on a country than complete sanctions. So, but in this scenario, we'll say that the diplomacy, it does what diplomacy normally does, and it acts as sort of a point of shame. So it's an option to sort of say, hey, what on earth, why are you doing this? But yes, that's a very valid point. Yes.
That's probably already, but I would probably attack that, try to back with that's why there's, we know that basically there where you probably what you bring it up if you actually, but especially with our social countries, they just do it happen. You're like, oh, you just do it, you didn't, then it would get nowhere. So I think that would probably be holding back for option.
In your reprisal attack, would you make it about the same level of impact, worse level of impact, slightly lower level of impact? Or do you sort of follow that? Was that all? Oh, that's very fair. Yeah, yes. Sure. How would your opinion change if we launched, say, or if the fictional nation of Narnia had launched an attack that was slightly less, or say significantly less impactful than this attack, versus an attack that was significantly more impactful than this attack? Would the answer be, would one of those scenarios lead to you attacking immediately, or would it both still, you think, demand diplomacy first? Sure. Yes.
I think, yeah, I feel like the context matters a lot. Like if you have been cordial with this country for a while and there's some like individual from the country that isn't associated with their higher ups, I guess, then maybe you wouldn't be launching a full-fledged attack. But if it's a country that you're already, you know, we have a lot of conflict with already, I kind of agree with what you said about, attacking others, just to like intimidate.
Yeah, that's right, because that's always the challenge, right? How do you know, was this the leadership? Was this some like random 14-year-old that just learned how to code, right? Where's the sort of intermediary there? Yes.
Yeah, so it's the same, something biased, but in Virginia during this time, about the cloning pipeline. Things
Yeah.
like
Oh, wow.
saw that. What I would do personally is do like diplomacy and force. Like I would proactively try to lurk in their entire network and not do anything, and be like, hey, if you cross this red line, like, we're gonna break your entire country, so don't do that. Which I think is sort of the approach the US have already sort of taken, although albeit with way less clear communication, and I want to admit like, oh, we're already in there. But
Just to be clear, this is Narnia.
Yes.
Another sort of interesting dimension to think about this is you have your nation of Charn attacking an oil pipeline that affects you, right? But realize, what if it also impacts some other countries, right? Allied countries, maybe. So that also gives sort of an additional incentive to do an attack, right? Because you know you have the backing of your allies because they're also impacted. This could like having like allied countries also allows you to transition from cyber warfare to normal warfare, right? So that's an interesting thought as well.
How much is it cost and how much has been added for the region? And then everything else that I don't know.
That's, I think, very fair, right? In all war is sort of a hugely expensive thing to do, right? Like even in cyber warfare, right? If you're paying for your power of compute and you're paying for, your quote unquote hackers who are highly skilled employees, that's an expensive thing to do. So you have to consider, right? How much will we actually hurt, or is this just an ego thing that we're doing? Anyone else have any opinions on this scenario? Yes. Well, that's sort of the question, right? Is that, I guess there's two folds, right? Technically speaking, the Geneva Convention doesn't, like, there are no war crime treaties on cyber warfare. So there's no way to say it's like a war crime. It's certainly a crime. But then also the question is, how do you say like this is directly correlated, right? Because if I, for example, have like really bad diabetes and you take out the power, now I can't get to my appointments on time to get my insulin and to get whatever medical assistance I need and I die, is that sort of, how do you say that's directly on some other nation?
Well, because they attacked something that they knew was civilian, because that potential can do that. I feel like it should be, this is a very utilitarian room. It should be about the actual result of what happened, at least if we're trying to be strict on war crimes, which I think at this point could be taken seriously.
I'm not sure we want to argue war, but I think I guess the interesting question, right, is any attack sort of, or if any joint use attack has these sort of components, right? Like, for example, if you're when the Allies bombed Dresden, right, how do you say, there's certainly argument it's a war crime and maybe valid ones, but how do you say, right, we hit these things that were the like central industrial focus of this country and that were allowing them to crank out their tanks and their guns and their whatnot, and civilian dies, right? Is one civilian dying enough to make it necessarily like an attack on civilians if it also took out like 20% of the industrial value of that country for war, right? Where do you sort of, that's part of the issue, right? Is that how do you draw this balance when, right, in cyber warfare, all of these targets are joint use targets, right? They have some, or sometimes they're just civilian targets, in which case you're totally right. And there's not even any sort of like question about it. But if you're hitting a like military and civilian target, how do you decide, right? Is this like an attack on our military? Is this just straight up terrorism? Is there sort of some weird gray area where you have to maybe litigate? Well, I guess you can't litigate it because it's not a war crime, but where you have to go to the UN and create new committees and say, here are the actual rules, which I think should happen, certainly. Yeah.
I'm not familiar with the concept.
The problem is that part of the real interesting thing here is that there really is no precedent, right? That it's because right now cyber warfare remains the domain of like 8 or 10 countries who are all very interested in having no rules on it so they can sort of play as they want. So I'm not even, I can't think of any cases where it's even been brought to the UN. I could be wrong on that, but it's sort of hiding essentially in a way that conventional warfare really doesn't tend to get away with. But any last opinions on this before we go to, let's go to you first and then.
Well, I suspect I know what taking this, but I have a list of clarification questions on the specifics. Would we be interested in that? Or would you-
Yeah, of course. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so one, when you say cybersecurity department, should I be imagining, CISA or NSA? Or I guess alternatively, should I be imagining someone who is willing to, talk about what they do in public or not?
Picture like a much larger picture. Let's say it's, for example, it's the sort of cyber warfare equivalent of the US Department of Defense. So a very, very large agency that essentially has both defense and, you know, offense responsibilities.
So if it's saying that you want, you can want to actually turn with the project, but you will do it.
Yes.
Okay, let's.
Although I think, I mean, the NSA also does that pretty, I mean, sorry, the NSA here is of course Narnia Security Agency, just to clarify. Sorry, say yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Any other,
Let's see, diplomacy, what exactly are you proposing? Are there any sanctions on chartered military around here? We got a conventional attack, we've had military bases in the area, what logistics of like. Talking about what's popular opinion in the country Narnia on the idea of war.
I think, let's see. So vis-a-vis diplomacy, I think it might be a more interesting question to sort of do twofold, right? On the one hand, if there are sanctions already, is it enough to just say, hey, what the heck, in a diplomatic response, whilst knowing you can't actually, again, implement more sanctions that already exist? If there are no sanctions, right, what are the like appropriate sanctions, right? I mean, is it like you take out a pipeline and now you have the same sanctions as in the hypothetical world as Cuba does in the real world, right? Military base wise, I'm willing to sort of abstract it and say I don't think it matters too much. We're assuming just sort of if you want to launch an attack, you know it will be successful and you're not at huge risk of reprisal because people are cyber warfare, not necessarily. I mean, that'd be a very interesting discussion for a different time. And then what was it? Sanctions. I'm blanking one of these.
I don't actually remember.
Uh,
I think were they trying to launch a cyber attack on your oil technology?
I think that's another thing we're leaving for sort of abstraction, right? Because someone I think up there mentioned earlier that it changes if you had attacked first and at what scale. So that I think is sort of up for the audience to decide, like, at what point is it fair to attack first, right? If you just, you know, nuke their capital, is it fair to then launch a cyber attack on you and you really have any ethical base to respond? Probably not, right? If you had just like, your ambassador just like coughed on the president, on the other hand, for example, it's probably kind of crazy to launch a cyber attack in response, and it's fair to have a reprisal.
I would actually argue,
Go ahead.
I would actually argue that it probably wouldn't even matter, right? Like, so a lot of like, you know, if we're thinking about like general, if we're thinking about, because if we're thinking about like this Department of Cybersecurity of Narnia is being run similarly to military personnel, they don't care really about what happened before, right? Sort of any attack in their eyes is sort of like an attack against, you know, the country, even if it's like justified, right? Because right, this is how escalation happens. So.
Right, and I was also saying, like, when it kind of goes back to the question of when does the, you know, cyber attack become a real military attack? Because you also have to consider if Narnia functions just like the US or China or Russia, they also have to consider their own benefits of if they were to launch a real attack on a supposed cyber attack from Charn, then they would have to, you know, take out a large sum of money to fund that military in whatever weapon that they would use. And is it really worth it for however much that they lost in the cyber attack is the real question.
Yes. All right. Any last Do you say you're asking?
Oh, just a very short sort of opening question. It's it seems like a lot of folks in the film included are a little softer on cyber attacks comparatively. But I was just thinking the exact same outcome from them launching an ICBM on hypersonic or light vehicle. I think diplomacy would be off the table. So that's all I want to say, just like an observation.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely valid, right? I think part of it is sort of generally the public has much less perception of like, oh, a cyber attack, or what's like the difference between, my computer's broken and the Russians hacked it. Like, that's not that crazy, right? Or even if it's, 100 million computers, it's sort of whatever, right? But if your neighbors got taken out by, a hypersonic missile, it's a lot more, we're clearly under attack, and it's much harder to say what's a measured response, I think is just like human psychology was. Yes.
Again, it also depends on the things. If you're running a individual regardless, you like tag that says not to go for diplomacy. It's sort of signal for them that you're not going to go all out the time. There will be potential escalated experience and then the very they're really determining that how they think the project is going to.
Yes, absolutely. All right, any last opinions, or should we move on to zone two? Nice, all right. What do you think?
Sure. Okay, so this is a kind of a continued scenario from the last one. Now, Chern has begun to build up the facilities needed for nuclear weapons. Your advisors tell you that you can stop this through a cyber attack, but the only possible method will also harm hundreds of millions of other devices. The conventional option is possible, but will you put your country into war? So I guess in this situation, it's kind of similar, kind of similar to when Russia was selling nuclear weapons to North Korea, but instead North Korea is now building their nuclear weapons. So, are you going to try to stop them, or because this would also harm other devices that, you're not really trying to launch a cyber attack through. Yeah.
I think either way, it's like military inspiration, and you're not really give it to a war. Don't really use that, it's not the thing.
Mhm.
I think you're more likely to get into a hostile scenario than, you try to stop it and damaging.
Yeah.
I think also matters if you're learning language. Like.
Are you saying that, so you would consider attacking them if we didn't have nuclear weapons, but they are going to?
Hmm.
Okay, so you're saying that you want to attack them if they become stronger than us. Okay, fair enough. Anyone else? Yeah. Yes. But
Well, it's totally hypothetical scenario. That's definitely not,
I would ask you to consider, they're only building up a facility needed for nuclear weapon. They haven't even started to, build those nuclear weapons. How can you tell that they're actually going to launch a war against you? They just have it. They might not use it, or they could, but because wouldn't it be obviously possible deniability, you could hire someone to, hack their system, but why would you, kind of attack them when it's a possibility that they won't even use it?
Yeah, I hear what you're saying earlier, this scenario is always going to be insecure, but it would be like, if computer wants to hack it, whether you then be able to build a nuclear weapon. Whenever you're just like, oh, if they do this, you have to stop them. They're just feeding into, it's like feedback loop, you going to attack and go attack you, and you extract away from the deeper causes that an argument trying to like each other. You're like, oh, it's just you're just continually moving away from actually solving them. And the people in both countries, hypothetical countries, focus on getting confused the news will be there, we're just thinking it's like that would for the conflict and conflict, and without like changing. At a logical level of people where you're just gonna. Continue so further down the road.
Yeah,
I think, yeah, like I would probably attack them because especially based on, are we assuming that the previous scenario already happened? Or is this like an entirely different scenario? I'm assuming that the previous scenario happens and now they're building nuclear weapons.
sure, let's just go.
How does it affect your opinion one way or the other? Like,
Well, because I feel like
If the previous scenario didn't
well,
happen.
I'm just like, in each case, how does your opinion change? Like, what's the?
yeah, so the difference between my opinion based on if that previous scenario happens, so if the previous scenario happens and now they're building nuclear weapons, then I would definitely suggest to attack because one, they have a weaker military, and two, if we can actually harm their devices and stop this, then if they disagree with us economically and socially, then like it's either, I don't know, it's gonna be one of us.
But what if they didn't launch it?
And if they didn't, that's when like it gets a lot more like different, because it's like you don't want to just exercise power
Mhm.
because you do have a larger military and you have the opportunity. Yeah, it would be definitely a
Okay, and obviously this is a scenario about Narnia, but like I would ask all of you guys to consider in the real world, there's never really they've never launched an attack on us, or they have launched an attack on us. It's all kind of like unclear because especially when it came to cybersecurity, it's a lot harder to tell if you can't really pinpoint them, which it's a lot harder to tell, like, should we launch an attack on them because it's possible for them to attack us. It's kind of like a balance.
One is that in this hypothetical scenario, right, the only possible method is also to farm hundreds of millions for the devices. I assume that we're talking about devices within the country, but I don't think this is a fair assumption because realistically, if we're going to farm hundreds of millions of devices, you're going to backdoor some sort of a generic device, which will apparently farm civilians in other countries. And how do you explain to the public that, oh, their internet is suddenly down and you cripple like 5% of the world GDP to achieve your military objective? I don't think that mathematically that will work out. The second thing is, if they're going to build a nuke and you stop them, they're going to try again. And let's just assume you use sanctions or technological methods, right?
Mhm.
They're going to develop less and less dependencies on you, and eventually you will have no power over what they're going to do. So I like, yes, but also I don't think this is I don't think the stopping would make much sense in the world.
So you would or you wouldn't launch an attack?
Certainly not in this time.
Okay. No, yeah, because you brought up an interesting point because if you stop their nuclear weapon development, you would also harm a bunch of, is it their devices? Let's just say it's their devices.
Hypothetical scenarios, as of course, hypothetical, not based on anything. I guess, how does it change your sort of thoughts?
No,
If hardening is like actually physically or temporarily like breaking the device versus if hardening is inserting some sort of self-replicating code to their device that they don't even know it exists, but you still have launched an attack on their device.
I mean, I guess in this case, harm is ambiguous, and
Yes.
spyware does minimal back to civilian spy. I would think that's more.
Oh.
But if it's like physically breaking, then like what percent of Americans are using phones manufactured in fact?
and also it says devices, so it's very ambiguous. So it could be medical devices that, might need electricity, just like in the previous scenario where they launched an attack probably to your military pipeline, but they also harmed 70% of your heating pipeline. So in this situation, it's kind of like you can't have the best of both worlds. So if you're gonna attack them, it's going to harm probably other devices because you can't just target one thing, you know what I mean? But yeah,
I will actually say, just sort of breaking from the analogies a little bit, that there is precedent for this, right? Like this is Stuxnet. Does anyone know like what the Stuxnet virus like actually did? Like technically?
Is that the one that caused the centrifuges to like spin like all the rest?
Yeah, that was the one that caused the centrifuges to spin out of control. And essentially the virus tweaked the parameters of the centrifuges so that way the nuclear warheads would become duds essentially. And while there were not any actual like I can't like speak on like victims or things like that, right? But for the most part, like it didn't actually like destroy facility, right? People died from it. There were incidents. But it was ultimately successful in doing that. And as of today, Iran is not known to have weapons of mass destruction. So
Just for clarification, like, in what context did you think that was really helpful?
I looked it up. It was like some centrifuges did like catastrophically get destroyed, and some like I believe Iranian researchers died as a result of that. So again, like like ethically, that's wrong, but or depending on your view of ethics, right? Like I'm not trying to impose my ethical framework on you, but right, like ultimately it was a successful attack based on certain countries' viewpoints. Since I saw her hand raised, but oh,
Also, like, so they were very specific, on the there is like a software of like a very specific center with the same company, which, also I think the Iranians have like kind of region or something that, they're not going to be, like launching community program. So there, the community program is a secret basically. And they were getting some confusions in the so the attack was basically so it like it impacted like a certain number of centrifuges and the diagrams ones. So it was very scary in the sense that they kept getting more centrifuges that they couldn't figure out to get one to know. And it was supposed to be it basically didn't want
last question for this particular thing. I think was it, do you have a point or a question? Okay, so
should we talk about the last one or should we not?
yeah, we're running out on time. So yeah, we'll sort of call it here, but there's a or actually what we can do, is you guys can go grab we have ice cream and cookies and root beer up there. So
Oh, I think
if you guys want to go on, we can also talk about the third scenario if you
Yeah.
want.
if you want to discuss with your friends.
Yeah.
No, this
So you need to.
no, the scenario. Okay, this
Oh,
one
hold on.
first.
Oh yeah, give me a moment.
All right. All right.
I'll get the food ready.
Yeah, here you go.
This right there.
Oh, yeah. So as you sort of get ice cream or don't, your choice, if you want to think about scenario 3, you definitely can, I guess. And if anyone has any clarifying questions, feel free to ask. Yeah.
See, into.
Exactly, yeah, yeah. And that's what I do, basically. It's engaging time.
They're sitting right next to the platform.
Exactly.
And I'm saying, right, there's no state like, make this one sort of have. Yeah, I mean, you know, that's stupid. I mean, it's just saying, it's very good.
My supply chain.
Yeah, exactly. But,
Yeah.
so, for the.
I said. Okay, so I would say. So I can just talk to everyone. So clearly, that's not how it works. So the main yeah, so exactly, but yeah, okay, I like that. Yeah, exactly. Because they have to do that and stuff that way. It's run their stairs, but then they have a assembly more than do it. Knowledge.
5 seconds. Yes, you were calling it.
I can also be wrong.
Yeah. I would just say like, yeah, I didn't find like what I was doing, that's what I So I just really found out it's finding 0 days in my microphones, already. However, that's so that's like the big thing I think of. That's not really like a game, it's just like for realty. I don't know where the money comes from. I would hope it's really complicated.
I don't agree. The US won, a lot of people won. Sent in like the sponsor vision and stuff, and went through and something was like, aha, nuts. And I think part of the right after this, flash.
I just want to
No, I was already like, yeah, I'll be honest with you guys. You're really and I already thought I don't know this one interference, so I'm not even joking. I mean, that's all it is. They're landing this like one of the they had some argument that's Asian bias and like, you know, the patterns are not and they're all yes, like you serve a source and then it's unique that it's already written so easy in the American like process so that here we're all
It's nothing new. It's now, I don't think they are. I don't think I'm not the fence like. Yeah, it's going fine. It's going fine. It's not a whole work. That's why. You have to certainly not decide. We could. It's more.
Right now. Long season. They do make traction. It's not going to be their defense. Still like Vietnam those like the ideas behind other it's just yeah what's issue always that are not for example a lot farther like so that's why they you know yeah and like we had 8 diamond like it's not very one thing yeah so out of the time I'm not really market like in the behind and it's just there so many problems so many things of course there are going to
Yeah.
I feel like you guys had like firewall configuration errors. Would you like recommend I guess?
We'll talk about firewalls. Sure. I'm going to run through some of just okay, I feel bad for like ending conversations, but I do want to hear your thoughts about scenario 3. So I'll be the one presenting on this. So after being defeated, Charn now has a new cyber academy where so many terrorists are now gathered. And they've already launched attacks which have resulted fatalities in the past. And now you have 100% reliable intelligence that they are planning an attack that will kill thousands. But also they have completely air gap environment, are immune to cyber attacks. So, or well, let's ignore the air gap part. We'll just focus on the above scenario. So what do you guys think? Yeah.
Soft insertion.
Soft insertion.
Yes.
Can you elaborate?
Yes, special forces. If this were a bioweapon or a chemical weapon or a nuclear weapon, right, this wouldn't even be a question. So in like this mythical world where we have 100% reliable intelligence, which is a human word, in my opinion, let's say we have that. I think this is like a pretty textbook example of when you could strike first, assuming that they were targeting civilians with that. If it's aim to kill thousands of your military folks, there's some nuance there. But if it's, hey, they're going to target civilians, they're military aligned, they're doing this for state interests, like, I don't think there's nearly as much nuance here as like scenario 2 or scenario 1.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, I feel like in this case, the possible design wouldn't be. So you can draw those recommendations.
I think one thing that's interesting to hear is like, even if like us as like the world leaders have this reliable intelligence, passing on that narrative to the public would be, for whatever we end up doing, would be like very like, I feel like that would be a bigger problem than how we deal with the terrorists. So I feel like if we have a stronger military and we have like a lot of different ways to like, physically bomb them or like attack them, and then it'll be more of an issue of us, our country internally, like pushing that narrative. And then remember, like I was talking, it's kind of like how if we had immigrants from that country, for example, in our country, whether they have terrorists or not, I guarantee that they wouldn't be all right with us attacking them without them actually existing.
Right. I'll get back to you about that in a bit, but I'm going for the situation.
I think that if they're aiming to kill thousands, it would sort of be like a 9/11. We sort of did not let it fester. I think actually the public would get a lot more negative towards you, as opposed to like actually going to try to do something. But I agree with Rohit that like dropping it blind or maybe like going striking if they don't have the capability that gets that. But if somebody if you're 100% reliable, but it's from like the somebody is taking a thousand for the US city, I think it would be pretty like what we get your side time. Like after that.
Right, but this is Narnia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess also, like, if they're not doing anything, they did attack. And kill thousands, at that point, we're not to respond, but you don't have to fight. Probably. The response that would be proportion that that one would be in constructive response. And you got to be able to the response after their attack might honestly have larger chances of like doing civilian fire. That might be the interrupt.
Do you have a
Yeah, I couldn't really hear much of what you said, and I was busy up there, but I don't know what exactly you guys discussed, but going off of, sorry, what's your name? The guy in the red, green, orange shirt. Sorry,
Suchin?
going off of his point, I think it's an interesting thought to say, obviously, we do have 100% reliable intel on that they're gonna kill us, but the problem is, do they have plausible deniability on whether or not they launched an attack that resulted in fatalities in the past? Like, how are we gonna prove that they were the ones that, resulted in those fatalities? Because if we can't prove that they did it and we just launched an attack because we have 100% reliable intel, we would technically be, or sorry, Narnia would technically be in the wrong. Because although, yes, we know that they're gonna attack and kill someone, kill thousands. If we launch an attack first against their possible attack, that doesn't stand up if you bring it to the UN or, United Narnia.
Just to clarify, they as in like charged or they as in the terrorists that turned to supposedly do the cyber academy? Because I think that makes it.
I mean, the Cyber Academy represents Trump, right?
Does it?
Well, do individuals planning an attack like this necessarily like, I guess like narratively they represent harm because like, let's say we got the great intelligence. Arguably, there's sponsors that are related to the military that are complex. We got the Calgary X-Pac, we got Sam Factor. So there's some government money here. If me and Ronan started planning a terrorist attack tomorrow, is that the university's fault? Is that the US's fault?
Well, I think there's this.
It's fine.
She makes a pretty good
I
point.
think the distinction here is that if you and Ronan did it, then you're terrorists. If like the CS Cares got a contract from the US Army that said, hey, go and like nuke China, and then they hired you to do it, then I think it's hard to argue not operating as an agent of the US Army in that, or I guess as maybe a lesser vigilance example, right? If the US Army gives Palantir a contract to build like sea-skimming missiles to hit China, and then you're building these missiles and like, I don't know, Seabull, and someone hits Seabull, I think then there's a separate argument versus just like, ACM students building bombs for fun.
I guess a better example would be like West Point. Like if like there were if we all were at West Point, I think experience of the actual is that West Point's fault? Is that the US's fault? Question.
I think that's fair. I think that if you were to essentially on your own claim that, I think that is probably not the US's fault. Although I think that
Don't make it the US's fault.
I think that it would be seen as the US's fault internationally, certainly. But I think the demarcation here is that that we're in our scenario, which I admit is ambiguous to an extent. The academy itself it's essentially a military academy training for this goal. That the goal is the goal of the academy as opposed to the academy students, and the academy is essentially an instrument of the state. In this,
Specifically a terrorism academy, as an academy that builds people up to attack civilians.
yes, it's specifically an academy dedicated to one act of quote unquote terrorism, right? I mean, I said so-called terrorists because, right, the argument is always right. Terrorists are sort of enemies of the government, right? So terrorists to one and martyrs to another and whatnot, but it's essentially a government agency built for this one attack. Yeah.
I will say that when you put it that way, it does make us sort of more black and white, right? Where it is ethically or morally or however you want to put it, like ideal to.
I think if you make this argument, you can continue, you can launch
Yeah.
and then just bombing UIUC pretty easily.
Right, yeah.
I'm not sure
So
we're gonna-
so that's also what I'm trying to say. Or that's also something I want to talk about, right? Because if you now approve if Narnia now bombs a university in some other country, right? You have now set precedent for attacking universities in foreign countries, which is a pretty big precedent, right? And you know, you can say all you want about, you know, they were going to do it. We had 100% reliable intel. But like,
They didn't do it, is the
yeah,
point.
ultimately, who is the aggressor here?
I don't know, I feel like any of those students would still be at fault, 'cause let's say like, you know, somebody descends from like, you know, the deep state and is like, hey, ICSSP, we need you to go build an NSA and implant your research project, you have your scholarship funding, right? It's like, yeah, you gotta like opt into that. And also, I know in China, there's an equivalent of this, they have like state-sponsored technical academies. And I feel like in both cases, that would be opting in to either of these things. Like, I feel like you're still at the same level of accountability structurally as any other military entity, right? Otherwise, we can just designate our force as murder academies and like, you know. Yeah, like I view these as equivalent institutions, right? I think even doing cyber along the school, that's still designed to take offensive, like harmful action, potentially toward other people. And I don't know if you could like easily opt out of that or put some sort of gray area into that, because it was like, oh, we're gonna go hit like the SEAL training stuff in like Dam Neck, Virginia. I don't think anyone would like, you know, even be surprised. So I don't know, maybe I'm like, maybe I'm not seeing this like you guys are, but I feel like we're still opting into that like offensive military.
Well, okay, so I'm going to shift the lens a little bit here, right? Because what you described was explicitly like a SEAL training academy where that's specifically training for war. Well, let's muddy things a little bit, right?
Okay.
We're saying here we have a cyber academy. So they're not explicitly training for, you know, war, right? Well, let's
They're just
let's-
learning about
They're just
cybersecurity.
learning about cybersecurity, right? The issue is that, you know, you have a major pipeline of these students coming into the government's like cyber military force, right? How does that, you know, how does that change things? Does it change things?
So this is sort of like the larger question for the earlier, so I feel a bias to like say because it's cyber, it's less serious. And for me, I view things as the objective, right? So I view the actions on objectives as what should be actively judged. I don't think there's anything different between remote code execution and delivering the payload via a missile if they're doing the same thing. Which I think is like an unpopular or like unconventional stance. But that's the lens through which I look at it. So if the objectives you're acting on are like, you know, the same as a conventional strike, I would argue the same level of accountability.
I guess my question is then, sort of put a point on it, right? Like the UIUC sends a lot of people to like DARPA and different, you know, naval research labs and whatnot. Is Illinois then a justifiable target for foreign power?
So that's actually a different question though, because this is 100% reliable intelligence, but planning.
Well, but in our new muddy situation, we're ignoring the second, because otherwise, otherwise the initial point solid. The question is, if, as in Minh's new scenario, all right, I guess we can call scenario 3B, right? You have this university where 40% or 60% are going directly into this government's military wing, the paramilitary wing, or whatever you want it to be, and trying to launch attacks continuously on Narnia. Is that a valid target, right? But you know that 20% of students are going to the agricultural sections, but are going to, you know, building civil service tools or what have you. Or even if it's 20% military, right, is it still a valid target?
I mean, I don't think anyone would be hitting someone that isn't explicitly going, this would be a valid target. Obviously, it would only be that subsection. So I was going under it's one monolithic academy assumption.
I think we didn't do a great job, just sort of to make it clear on the narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't even use like a model for the academy. If they weren't 100% sure, if they weren't a model for the academy, I think we could show all the university side, we have to address them for this fine. But going back to like, yeah, this is where I think of this, like, sorry.
Well,
Camille. What? Oh, Camilla.
Like this scenario where, you know, it's like, well, you go to the UN, they will like think you as the aggressor. I mean, I guess like if you were smart, you would just like find it on somebody else, like it forward operate
Hypothetical Narnia and other companies.
Technically, Narnia would be smart to on and off and not be putting that.
Yeah, but I also want you guys to consider, is there another option besides, a conventional attack or cyber attack that you can launch? I know we talk a lot about sanctions. Is there, for example, totally hypothetical, Narnia and Charn could, go into a trade war or other possible options. It doesn't necessarily have to be only those two options.
That's series of intelligence failures that like that made it possible. So I don't think it's perfectly reasonable to think that if you have enough focus on that and aim to fill and aim at you, that you could do other things to protect yourself, because it's not because like who are they to say that I'm going to make them happen, but it's the vulnerability that they were using. Not a few days before they were failing,
I mean, I guess for the sake of argument, right, is the question, I guess, is the role of government to sort of, this is a much more philosophical question, right? What's the role of government, right? Like, for example, I'd argue that, right, the role of government, right, is sort of but the role of government, right, is it depends on your view, right? Because if you think the role of government is to protect the civilians, right? It's not only like fundamentally responsible, it's wildly unethical to say, all right, here's a group of people, they want to kill thousands, but we've stopped their one attack vector. And so now we're done and we're going to just keep playing defense, right? But if your role of government is to sort of maximize human happiness or utility or peace, I think that's a very fair point, right? Like, how do you see the role of government, right? Is it to stop out threats, or is it to try to like reach the best possible life for as many people as possible? Yes.
With this conflict happening, and what? Not to say that I'm pro anarchy, that's not really their thing, but with this conflict would not be happening if we did not have a government. So I feel like it's the government's job to keep it in check.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to argue against anarchy, never mind. This is just gonna be a wild tangent. Sorry, you ready?
No.
I mean, okay, yes.
I just kind of don't like the idea. Whether or not like the conventional attack, I think depends on like what the potential for like escalation after that. It's like we use drone strikes to like kill people all the time. I think that's like a big about. But it would be very different if there's like we launched drone strikes about like human racists or like Islamic terrorists or something like that. There's not much room for escalation there. Like there's not going to be like a result that kills like tens of thousands or millions at like century. But this would say like Russia and like I said Charn is some kind of country with like really powerful military. That's a lot of
So what you're saying is your answer changes on like if we have the conventional military superiority, we should just go for it because we're not really worried. But if that's not the case, then you sort of have to think that out, which I think, yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's for all this. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's very possible, like the fundamental question here, sort of what's the cost of action versus which is sort of like, obvious because that's always the question of any decision. But in war, especially, right, like, what's the cost of this attack and how much is the cost to respond? Right? Like if some guy throws a rock and hits a US bus and causes $80 of damage, like parking the minutes off of its coast is probably a mistake, right? But if someone like, hits the Empire State Building with like a nuke, obviously, then you can send the minutes pretty, yes.
Yeah, I also think it is important to kind of, especially in like and that his argument, kind of considering the like how, like the economic state of that country. So for example, like they do follow something similar to what you're doing. Because as a government, like you obviously you're trying to like provide a service for your people and like work for a nation. But there's also like a sense of like power within that like macro scale where like, for example, you're part of a group with other Narnia-like countries that's gonna, you know, pass legislation for the whole world. And so like kind of being able to keep your market share with like your type of government that Narnia has may be important because if you have somebody that is rivaling the way your economy works, the way you see the world, then it's you don't want anybody rivaling it because you want to get to the top or you want to keep that power that you have from your military strength.
Yeah, that's right. You know, I was gonna make fun about similar, that's a bad one, but, yeah, we don't need to do current politics, but I think that's, yeah, totally valid. I think, like, how does the scenario change if, for example, Chard is, sort of quote unquote, like typically subsidiary power, and Chard is,
Has a different economic.
right, like if it's not even a rival at all, they're just packing for some sort of cultural divide. If they're a member of hypothetical version of NATO, right, where they like some sort of, I don't know, strangely having the government temporarily, but typically they're like your best, right? Like if Canada launches a drone strike on the US, right? There's a very different response.
Literally.
And you know, maybe justified. Right. But there's a very different response than if like Russia sends a drone over to the US or if, you know, China, if I don't know, it's like
Yeah, I guess in my point, what I was saying is like, because those two countries have very different economic backgrounds and systems,
Yeah.
then the response is going to be different because of how different they are from.
Oh, I see. So you're saying essentially like the extent to which Chart is like a threat to the system of your country.
The system, yeah, it's an attack on the system because like your system has a certain amount of power and a certain amount of like pull with other countries that are similar to it.
Right.
And so like, if we had a NATO like group in this scenario that had a group of countries with the same system, then if Charn is a part of that similar system, or if they have a very different economic system, then that could also be considered for like how big of a threat they would be and how intense you would respond to that.
Yes.
Going off the technological advance, like saying, right, so when we're talking about conventional attack, I think we also need to think about what objective it is and what kind of conventional attack we're conducting, right? So many terrorist organizations would instantly fall apart if there is no leader. So if we can just send a drone to explode in its backyard, that's obviously way better than just, you know, taking the entire Afghanistan and retreat miserably. So
Yeah, that's fair.
I think it really depends on what kind of objective they're looking at, and if it's a limited, if it's a very limited objective, let's say kill Osama bin Laden, and via a drone assassination, I think that's somewhat viable. But if you're actually like going after the entire failed state of theirs to, you know, purge the entire terrorist organization, that's less viable. And if we're even planning on reinstating a government where no government ever existed on this land, then you know, the US failed to do that, so.
Well, I mean, I think there's been, I don't know, I can send some papers out later of, there's very interesting arguments to make that you can rebuild the governments if you first destroy all the vestiges, right? Like when MacArthur made the Emperor of Japan essentially submit on national radio, right? That it's hard to argue that the Japanese government wasn't subsequently completely reshaped from what it was before, as an example. But this is a very different argument.
Yeah,
But-
I feel like we're kind of straying a little bit from Cyberwarfare here, guys. But all right, for the sake of time, and so we don't end up talking about war all day.
When is
I mean, technically,
ended.
yeah, technically it's over, but yeah. Does anyone have any last minute comments, remarks? Yeah,
The what?
I put spy in there and then like. the spy in the
Yeah.
Yeah.
maybe that's where the 100% reliable intelligence came from.
Yeah.
All right, thank you all for coming. Feel free to stick around and grab some more cookies. We might end up taking them over to ACM.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for coming, guys.
Thank you all for coming. Stay warm. Come to SIGPwny meetings more often. Okay.
Very certain. I think